Good morning, everyone. Once again, my name's Gabby. I'm one of the pastors here. And we are in a series about adopting Jesus's posture, where we're considering that living a life of purpose is not about having the right job or knowing the right people or living in the right place, that it's actually about how we approach life. Specifically, that we find purpose when we take the same approach as Jesus, that we live a life of purpose when we live as Jesus did. And this morning, we're talking about Jesus's posture of justice, which brings to mind, for me, kind of a top of mind, because recently I was involved in a matter of justice. You see, just a few weeks ago, Isaiah and I were out with our junior hires, and Isaiah had promised one of our students, Lillian, that if she went on the mission trip, he would buy her Starbucks. Now, I was not advising Lillian at this time. Personally, I think she could have driven that bargain up a little bit more and gotten a little more out of the deal, but it's her prerogative, it's her thing. But anyway, the mission trip comes around and Lillian still has not yet received her Starbucks. So she does what any seventh grader would do. She acquires legal counsel, and I use that loosely because the legal counsel was me and ChatGPT, and we drew up some papers to serve Isaiah a lawsuit. I believe we have a video.
Lillian, what are we about to do?
Suing Isaiah. He has owed me Starbucks since May, and I'm not going to let it slide.
And what do you have with you?
The papers.
To serve him?
Are you ready? Come on.
Wait, say you've been served.
And there we went to serve Isaiah his papers. He was taking a nap at that time, but it did not stop us from letting him know what was happening. And you know, it was a long and strenuous battle, but I am happy to report we were able to settle out of court. And Lillian got her justice after
Dropping my lawsuit now that I have my drink.
What did you get?
Blueberry lemonade.
She's dropping her lawsuit, everybody. So justice was served, yes. If only justice could be that sweet and that simple, right? However, most of us know that the real deep issues of justice that we face are a lot messier and more complicated than that. They can't be solved with a little bit of ChatGPT and some blue lemonade. In his book, A Light to the Nations, Michael Gohan writes about the ways that a community centered on Jesus is supposed to be distinct from the rest of the world. And he cites a few different ways that we are supposed to be different and says things like love and obedience to God, our forgiveness, peace, and joy. And then he goes on to write this. I'm just going to summarize it for you. If you're fast readers, you can read it yourself. But essentially, he's talking about this idea that our community as followers of Jesus is supposed to be centered around this concept of justice. And this has actually been very core since the beginning. The promise of Jesus' coming involves this promise that he is going to seek first the justice of the kingdom. You can go to the next slide. Now, this word has typically been understood kind of as like our own personal righteousness or holiness, but really it has this big communal aspect to it. That Jesus' intention for us seeking justice has this economic, political, and social implication to it. And what it means is that we are supposed to be looking out specifically for the poor and the vulnerable in society. And I love the way he wraps it up. He says, the community that forms around Jesus is to be characterized by this high concern for justice. And when you read this quote and you think about that concept, that emphasis that Jesus has on this community centered around justice, I wonder what you are feeling. I wonder what you're thinking about, what's coming to mind. Because I know for me, my first reaction is a description like this sounds really beautiful. This idea that as a community, we are meant to be people who seek out justice, who seek out love and fairness for everybody, regardless of who they are. That's a beautiful vision. It's a high calling. But second, I get a little bit nervous when I think about this. because that is a really grand ideal to live up to. I'm not sure I'm up to the task to living a life around this idea of justice that feels pretty intimidating. I'm not sure that I'm up to the task. And last but not least, I feel a little bit of wariness, because I know that this term justice, it comes with a lot of cultural baggage attached to it, especially when we start talking about the economic and social and political implications. And if I'm honest, I'd really prefer not to rock the boat or ruffle any feathers this morning. Yet undoubtedly, a core part of Jesus' posture on earth was one of justice. And to turn away from the concept altogether just because of the potential societal landmines would be like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So hear this. I understand that this term is loaded. I understand that our concept will be to map out whatever specific ideology we have on the concept of justice, maybe without meaning to, onto the words that I'm saying, or to get frustrated about the ways in which we see justice inadequately or unfairly lived out in our society. But as the quote we just read points out, woven into our very DNA as a community of people who center our lives around Jesus is a concern and expression of justice. And I believe this morning that it is both possible and really important for us to do that in the world today. So let's look about how Jesus approached the world with a posture of justice. He does that in Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 18. This is the first thing he says as he begins his ministry. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began by saying to them, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." You see, what Jesus is doing here is he's quoting from Isaiah chapter 61, a passage that was famously said to be about the Messiah, which is this coming king that was promised by God to bring his blessing and judgment to the world. And so Jesus, by reading this passage and then saying, "It's fulfilled today," he is pointing to himself and saying, "I am him. I am the Messiah that you've been waiting for." But that's not all Jesus is doing in this passage. He's also telling them why he has come. And frankly, I'd expect it to be something along the lines of like a John 3:16. That he would talk about, God's great love for the world, his forgiveness, his grace for sinners. And of course, these elements are incredibly core to Jesus' message and why he's come to earth, but it's not what he starts with. It's not what he says first. Instead, the first thing he says is to talk about freedom. Freedom for prisoners, freedom for the oppressed, sight to the blind, which is a different kind of freedom to see the world as it truly is. And he means this both on a spiritual level, like freedom from the oppression of sin, and on a physical level. My guess is, in this room, most of us resonate more with the spiritual reality of that. We understand or resonate with this need to be freed from the spiritual oppression of sin. Because most of us don't actually experience oppression or injustice. But that doesn't make Jesus' words any less true. Yes, he has come to set the world free from the spiritual oppression of sin, but he has also come to bring freedom for those who experience physical oppression. In fact, for Jesus, those two things are actually bound and connected together. And then Jesus ends this reading by talking about this pronouncement of the year of the Lord's favor, this year of Jubilee, it was called in the Old Testament. And it was this practice that was decreed by God that said that every 50 years, all the debts would be repaid. And not because people had paid them back or because they deserved them. They were to be repaid as a sign of God's character and his abundant grace. That's why they were called to be repaid back. And it was said that this practice never actually got lived out in the Old Testament, but Jesus says, as he reads it, that this type of reality has actually come with him. And in it, we learn about God's heart for justice. That his heart is not that everyone would have just enough, but instead, his heart is about everybody having an abundance, more than enough. And Jesus says, that type of living, that year of Jubilee begins now with me. Justice has come. And if you were to read this passage more, what you would find is that initially Jesus' listeners love it the first time they hear him say these words, and then just a few moments later, they want to literally kill him for it. Because it's good news. It's this beautiful message that God's abundant grace has come for you, but not just for you. God's abundant grace has also, as it turned out, come for the outsiders and for their enemies. The people who, if they had their choice, would experience God's justice not as a blessing, but as a punishment. And I think in the crowd's reaction, as it often is the case in Scripture, we can recognize a tendency in our own hearts, a pattern of our own way of living, to desire justice for ourselves, but to hesitate at the idea that the same justice would be applied to everyone else as well. You know, when I was a kid, my sister and I would go spend a week with my grandparents. We called it Girls' Week. And Girls' Week was a blast, but one of the core elements of it was that we would play an entire game of Phase 10 every single day. And if you've ever played Phase 10, it is not a short game. Like, it would take us hours. And my sister and I took it very seriously. We'd make a little chart. We'd tape it to the fridge so we could keep track of who had won each game each day, because at the end of the week, there was a prize for the winner. Now, honestly, my grandma would buy all of us prizes because she just couldn't bear that someone would not get a prize. And so that didn't really matter, but the pride of winning really did. And I remember one day my grandpa introduced a rule in the middle of the game, which is kind of reckless if you ask me. But he said, as he was shuffling, that if me or my sister cut the deck, so selected the exact right number of cards, so by the time it was dealt out, there were no cards left, we would get to skip a phase. Okay, pretty good advantage. Now, this is something my sister managed to do not once, not twice, but 3 times in a single game. It was outrageous. It was totally upending the integrity of the game. That's like more than an advantage. It's handing her the win. Even as an 11-year-old, I was very competitive. And so I'm like angry and furious. And I remember telling my grandparents that much, which, you know, she probably won. My sister's in the front row. You probably did win that game that day. But as I think about it, I really wouldn't have been that upset if I was the one cutting the deck right 3 times. And as I was thinking about this story, of all the years we played Phase 10, I remember that my grandparents never really won. Like, we played a lot of games of Phase 10, and somehow when it came down to the end, it was always either me or my sister with the winning hand. You see, what I found is that I am totally okay with unfairness as long as it's in my favor. And that is the power and the challenge in Jesus' message of justice, that it's for everyone, even the people we don't like. And it's not this vague, up in the sky, when we get to heaven kind of justice. Jesus says it is freedom here and now. And so how do we get that posture that Jesus has? That posture of justice. What I want to do is take you to a scene from the Gospel of John as a sort of case study of how Jesus lives this out. In John chapter 8, it says this, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand up before the group and said to Jesus, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses, it commands us to stone such a woman. What do you say?' They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, 'Let any one of you that is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her.' Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground, and at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older one first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, 'Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?' 'No one, sir,' she said. 'Then neither do I condemn you,' Jesus declared. 'Go now and leave your life of sin.'" Now, there is much to say about this story, but at its center, it's a story about hypocrisy, where we practice of expecting somebody else to be moral, even when we ourselves do not hold ourselves to that standard. And so in a situation of hypocrisy, what do we see Jesus do? Well, first, we see a way that Jesus sees people. You see, he sees people instead of pawns. The religious leaders, they don't appear to be particularly concerned about this woman. Now, certainly adultery is a sin, which I think is what increases the tension in this story, because this woman has actually committed a sin. But really, why they bring this woman to Jesus is just so that they can trap him. You see, they want Jesus to tell this woman that her sins are forgiven so that they can accuse him of not following the law of Moses. For them, this woman is nothing more than a pawn in their scheme to kind of catch Jesus saying something wrong. But Jesus doesn't see people as pawns. He sees all people as created in the image of God. Notice how Jesus addresses this woman. He calls her woman, which to our ears today might sound a little bit rude or grating, but at that time was not a disrespectful term at all. In fact, I think it would be reminding her of her own humanity, that she is more than what she has just done. And this is a reflection of God's posture that has been true since the very beginning of creation. In the beginning, God creates humanity, and it says that he creates them in his image. And what that does is it gives humans a level of dignity and value that is unlike anything else in all of creation. And what that means practically is that people cannot be used as pawns or objects or talking points. Asa Macaulay, a New Testament scholar, he describes it as this. He says, "This vision begins with respect for equal dignity based on the idea that we are all made in the image of God. It abhors, it's against any attempt to dehumanize anybody on any front. We may unjustly divide in so many ways, but we are united by being all part of the same creation." I just finished a book, and by just finished, I mean literally at 9:30 last night, because I wanted to be able to tell you that I just finished it. It's a nonfiction book. It's a true story on the Congo called King Leopold's Ghost. And it's the complicated history of the Congo, but at its center is this figure, King Leopold. I believe we have a picture of him. He was a Belgian king through kind of political maneuvers and great deception, was able to declare the Congo as his kind of own personal state. And what he did is he systematically mined that land of all of its, or a large portion of its natural resources, and he did that on the backs of really grueling slave labor. It is said that under King Leopold's reign, that he is responsible for the death of 8 to 10 million people, which was half of Congo's population at that time. And he did all of this without ever coming face to face with a single person who lived there. He never once stepped foot in the Congo. He never had to experience the horror of his reign in somebody else's face. The book states that in any system of terror, functionaries must first of all see the victims as less than human. Now, this is an extreme example, but it's also a true one. And it shows us the danger of what happens when we allow people to become less than. And it shows us just how powerful this posture is, that when we believe that all people are created in the image of God, we will be unable to reduce them down to anything less. That if we see people as made in the image of God, we can't see them as just their job title or something they've done or their political affiliation. They have to be more than that. So I just ask you this morning, who are you tempted to view too simply? Who are you tempted to reduce down to just see as an attribute or a trait, to see one thing and to assume you know their whole story instead of a full person? But here's another incredible thing about Jesus, is that he doesn't do this work of justice out of deep-seated anger or bitterness. Instead, his posture is generated by compassion. And that compassion is indiscriminate. You see, when I hear this story, I get really mad at the religious leaders. I'm like, how dare they treat this woman like this? And you know what I want Jesus to do? I want him to give them a taste of their own medicine. I want him to make them feel a little bit like the way that they made that woman feel. But Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, yes, he reminds the men that they are sinners too, but he lets them walk away. He shows them compassion too. And it still surprises me, and I think this reveals something else that I think sets Jesus' posture of justice apart. And it's this, that in Jesus' posture of justice, there are no enemies. Macaulay says it like this: you can't get to just ends with unjust means. History, both ancient and modern, shows us that we will often demonize, villainize, and mistreat the people that we see as unjust actors. If you do something against me, that gives me the right and the privilege to mistreat you. And that is just not how Jesus works. I mean, this is the God who when dying for the sins of the world as a sinless man, is hanging on a cross, looking at the onlookers that are celebrating his death, and he has the audacity to say, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. This is where Jesus' justice gets challenging. It's that in God's economy, there is compassion for everybody. So as we close, I just want to give you a few principles that we can carry with us when it comes to having Jesus' posture of justice, because the issue and the ethic may change, but the heart of God doesn't. And so first is this, that holding Jesus' posture means that everyone is made in the image of God. Even the crooked politician, even the prisoner in the cell, even the person on the news or on the street corner, everyone deserves dignity and value, even if we don't like them or what they do. In fact, we're called to fight for their dignity and value, both physically and intangibly, whether or not we think they deserve it. You know what I tell my circuit students all the time? I say, you can't let anyone but God define your value. No one besides God gets to determine how much you're worth. God has already determined that. And so as followers of Jesus, we take that same mantle upon our shoulders and we live with the reality that we also don't get to set the value of another person. God has created them, and so whether we like it or not, they're given inherent dignity and value. They have the unique capacity to reflect God's image into the world, and so who are we to suggest that they could be valued at anything less than? The second thing is this, that holding Jesus' posture of justice means that no one is beyond redeeming. I think that we are so quick to write people off, that in our era of polarization, we see something somebody does, a road that they're walking down, or a belief system that they have, and we get to, in our own wisdom, say, well, they're just too far gone. We can just be done, and they can just let it play out. But do you know what Jesus does? He doesn't just make bad people good, he makes dead people alive. That's what it says. When you're freed from sin, you are literally spiritually dead and brought back to life. You are quite literally, quote unquote, too far gone, but not too far gone for Jesus. And so as people that live out of his posture, we do that with a deep sense that nobody is beyond redeeming, that nobody is too far gone. The third thing is this, that our compassion never runs out. This is where I think that vision of Jubilee really comes into our reality, that we live with an abundant grace, that grace for us is not a finite resource. It's not something that we can only give out to certain people before we're depleted. It is something that we are invited to give out of abundance. Because in Jesus' economy of justice, there aren't winners or losers. Everyone gets compassion. And I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it because it's so against what I think and what makes sense to me. But Jesus has this way of showing compassion, yes, to the oppressed, the people that need it desperately. And then in this weird Jesus way, he has the ability to show compassion to the oppressor too. That as we walk and we look in the world, we take on Jesus' mantle of saying, our compassion never runs out. There is enough for everyone. And then lastly is this. Okay, well, I'll just tell you what it is. Justice draws us near. That Jesus' posture of justice draws us near. I think we've been seeing this throughout the entire series of adopting Jesus' posture. Really, I think they're all just creative ways to say that Jesus comes close. That Jesus is in the business of making somebody else's problem his problem. Remember, he is sinless, and he chooses to make your problem, your sin problem, his own problem. Because he loves you that much. And so when we live out of Jesus's model of justice, we go around actually choosing to make people's problems our own. It sounds insane. I hate doing that. I'm just being honest. I hate when someone else's problem gets in my way, and because I think we live in this era of individualization and of making sure I'm at peace all of the time and rest because life is stressful, and yeah, that's true. And as Jesus followers, we're not meant to run away from that. A really good way to say, am I living out of Jesus' posture of justice is, am I currently making somebody else's problem my own problem? Because that's what Jesus does for you and for me. And so we're invited as we go about this world to see everyone as being made in the image of God. When the latest issue comes up on the news, to remember that no one is beyond redeeming. When we find ourselves in an interaction or seeing a group of people that we don't like, we're remembered that compassion never runs out. And when we see the world and the mess that it's in, we are reminded that our justice means that we draw near. That we are people that run not away, but towards. Why? Because Jesus runs towards you. Because he did it once, and he's still doing it now, and he'll do it again. And we are empowered by his Spirit that lives inside of us. So would you pray with me? Lord, we are, first of all, amazed by your compassion and your mercy and your grace, that it never runs out for us. So even when we're tempted to feel like we're the person that's beyond redeeming, when we're the person that's too far gone, you declare that we are not. That our life is one worth dying for, Lord. And so would you embed that truth deep down in us so that it would become not just something that we know is true for ourselves, but actually a way in which we see the world, Lord. Would you overwhelm us like you want to with your grace and your mercy and your love so that we have more than enough, not just for ourselves, but so that other people might be receivers of that, might receive some of your great blessing to them. Help us be people that rise above all that wants to pull us down so that we might love like you love and serve like you serve to a world that needs it. We pray this in your name.